Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Speaker Hickman and Senator Marlette this morning to give us a legislative wrap-up. And I'll let you guys toss a coin as to who wants to go first.
We kind of enjoy the chance to catch up on what's going on when we get back home. When we're in the Capitol, we're also busy on each side of the building, and we actually see each other more at home than we do in Oklahoma City. So it's good to have a chance to compare notes. Good morning, and thank you guys for coming out. Senator and I were talking on the phone this morning as we were driving in, and I don't know that a lot changed from when we got together in May until now. The budget that we had been working on through session didn't really change much in the final weeks. It was a product that we've been working on and kind of knew the challenge that we faced with a $611 million budget hole, and things really kind of fell in place on a lot of the big items. So there wasn't a lot of change in the budget in its final form that passed the House and Senate that the governor signed. All in all, I think we ended up at a pretty good place with a good budget considering the challenges that we faced. That said, we probably pulled every last rabbit out of every last hat that was available. And if things don't improve, and we're not seeing just real encouraging news in our recent elections, that means next year, the budget we build next year, we'll have some very significant cuts in it. And so just a word of caution that when you use every last rabbit out of every last hat, it makes it, really did the best we could for this year, but obviously we need to be preparing for next year. Some of the highlights of the budget, some of the significant things that we were able to do in terms of prioritizing or reprioritizing, which required deeper cuts in other areas. The Healthcare Authority is suffering from about $140 million. Is that what we decided?
Yeah.
I think it was around $140 million in cuts in federal funding that the Healthcare Authority will no longer have. And working with the director, he said if we could get $18 million of additional state dollars, again, we got a $600 million budget hole, but if we could increase his funding $18 million, he could avoid across-the-board cuts to hospitals and physicians and providers, and could do targeted cuts in key areas. And we were able to do that. Again, $18 million doesn't replace $140 million in federal funding that is gone, but it avoids those deep across-the-board cuts to our hospitals and providers. But what it will result in is some reductions in other areas. But our Medicaid program in Oklahoma, which now a very large percentage of our population qualifies for, which is concerning as well as a state that we have so many people that qualify for Medicaid, it has become a full-service insurance program. And that was never what Medicaid was intended to be. It was intended to be a safety net. It was intended to be a stopgap to help those with extreme medical expenses in extreme situations, not a full-service medical plan. And so there will be some changes in those plans and in what is covered by our Medicaid to move it more towards a safety net type program, which is what it was always intended to be, not a full comprehensive insurance plan. We simply as a state can't afford to provide a full comprehensive insurance plan to a very large percentage of the population. That's not possible, and have the dollars to do other things that we want to do. And so there are things that have been covered over the years by Medicaid that will no longer be. There may be things like allergy testing. There may be things like sleep testing and sleep apnea type treatments, those kinds of things that aren't extreme, dire, emergency, life-threatening situations that may no longer be covered or at the same level. There will be some changes in provider reimbursement rates. We are one of, if not the only state that reimburses our providers with a physician or PA or on down at the same rate. Medicare reimburses PAs, I think 85% of what they pay a physician, and so we'll be making some adjustments in those areas. And those are all things that will be felt across the state, but they're all corrections that are going to have to be made in order to bring us in line with what all other states are doing and with what Medicare is doing. We can't simply afford to continue to pay these premium levels and have the money that we need for other areas of state government. So we did, again, increase $18 million, which doesn't offset the federal funding cut, but it does allow the director to do what he was hoping to be able to do. At DHS, same situation there. We increased their funding by $15.9 million. A lot of that will go to the Pinnacle plan, which is by court order. We are under a federal court order of additional revenue that has to go to DHS. They basically tell us how much more we'll spend, and we write the check. And we are in the process of continuing to hopefully make improvements in the area of child welfare. The DHS director has done what we see agency directors do every time that there are budget cuts, and we know that when we don't line item things, and there's always a battle of the capital. Do you line item these things so that you make sure the dollars get where they need to go, or do you allow agency directors the flexibility to adjust? And a lot of times you see agency directors will cut the most popular or most public things in their agency. And so DHS is making some changes in other areas, but they did receive a almost $16 million increase in their budget. Again, a lot of that court order that will go to the Pinnacle plan. That's the plan that you may remember Governor Fallon has asked Governor Askins to go over and manage and oversee implementation of the Pinnacle plan. We're just not getting where we need to be. We're not getting where we need to be as a state in terms of what we would like to see, and we're not getting to where we need to be in terms of the court's opinion that is directing us to make changes in that area as well. Our numbers of children in state custody, rather than declining, which they were intended to do by investing in this program and making the changes, in fact have not been. And that's very concerning as a state, something that we have to address. Corrections, same deal. The Department of Corrections, we were able to increase their funding by $14 million. Again, a system in crisis in our state, 120% of capacity and about 60% staff. Last I checked, Mr. Holder's on the board. He may have more even recent figures than I do, but it was hovering around 120% of capacity and 60% staff. It's just kind of where we've been. Again, one lawsuit away from a similar situation in corrections and what we face in DHS. We were able to make some progress, not as far as we would have liked, but we were finally able to make some progress. The governor has become supportive of some of these corrections and reform items that we've been working on. We were able to get several things through. I think several little pieces that hopefully add up to something significant long term in corrections, but we have to find a better way to manage our prisons, or we'll be right back where we were as a state not that many years ago with federal control of our prison systems. And when that happens, it's just like DHS. You're required to write a check, and that's dollars that the people you elect can't send to education or roads and bridges or healthcare or any other area of state government, and that's the case there. Some of the things that we were able to do in terms of reform in that area, one of them in particular was to allow the Department of Public Safety to work with offenders when they come out to be able to get a commercial driver's license, to a restricted one, but to be able to get a job. So if an offender comes out and they still owe a restitution to the state or whatever it may be, they can't get a license to get to work, or they can't get a CDL to get a job as a saltwater truck driver, or wherever it is you might need that employee and a chance to be able to get a job and support themselves so they don't return to whatever it was that led them into our prison system. We were able to get that passed through the House and Senate. The governor signed that, and offenders will be able to get a restricted CDL and hopefully be able to get a job to be able to earn the money they owe back to the state or to a victim of a crime. Licensing changes as well. That was another significant thing we were able to do. When you leave prison, if you want to get a license to work, and again, many of our professions now require a license from the state, but we don't allow offenders to be able to get those licenses. If it's an area that's not related to the crime that they committed, then they would be able to get that license. Same with the CDL. If you were in prison for a DUI, we're not going to give you a CDL license. But if you were in for something else, you could. Same way on professional licenses. If you want to be a barber and you were in prison on writing hot checks, then it's probably okay for you to get a license to be a barber, for example, or a heat and air contractor, or whatever it is. But to be able to free that up, if it's not related to the crime that you were convicted of, to be able to get that license and to get that job and to enter the workforce and hopefully become a tax-paying citizen and not someone that returns to our prison system. One of the most significant reforms that we were able to pass was some judicial discretion on sentencing. Not sentencing reform, not changes in any sentences, but to judges more discretion, case-by-case basis, to be able to make a decision about whether a mandatory sentence really applies to an individual situation. And that will give judges a little more discretion to be able to manage on a case-by-case basis, and that's significant as well. And then one of the other things, when we started the session, Governor Askins was the interim director of the Pardon and Parole Board. She now, as I mentioned, has moved over to DHS to work on pinnacle plan implementation. But one of the things we worked with her on is a tool that they needed at Pardon and Parole, which is amazing that in 2015 that they didn't have at their disposal, and that's the use of GPS monitoring. Pardon and Parole did not have the authority as a condition of parole to require GPS, an ankle bracelet, or GPS tracking or monitoring. And we were able to get that done as well. That's important for a couple of reasons. One, it's important to be able, for people that you do release, to be able to know where they are if you feel like that's necessary when they're first coming out of prison, to have that tool, resource to be able to track from a public safety standpoint. It's also important from a management standpoint because there may be an offender that you would otherwise release if you had that tool, but without that you wouldn't. And this gives the Pardon and Parole Board another tool, another condition they can use as a condition of parole at their disposal, so that there may be an ability to move an offender from one level to another. So again, I think a change that hopefully over time will help us manage our offender population. So several things, there were some others, but several things that hopefully move us a little farther along in the effort to make some changes and some reforms in a really a system that continues to be in crisis. Those are some of the highlights on the budget. There were some reform measures that we put in place as well. As we've talked before, we don't have a revenue problem in Oklahoma. We've got a $600 million budget hole, but we don't have a revenue problem. And how can that be? And we've discussed that before. There are a couple of reasons that we're in this situation that we're in. And it's again, the layoffs, particularly in the energy sector, have been a challenge, not only for this community in this county, but for our state. When you have several thousand people that are laid off that aren't remitting income tax out of their paycheck every couple of weeks or every month, that impacts our revenues. The gross production tax, more so on natural gas than oil, was an issue for us this year. We projected the oil price to be around $50, and it was kind of below that, kind of hung in that relative area. But natural gas was projected to be $4 in the budget that we built for last year, and it's been closer to $2. And so gross production tax on natural gas was an even bigger issue for us than on oil. But really the issue that we face continues to be a structural budget issue in Oklahoma for a couple of reasons. We build about a $7 billion budget annually in Oklahoma. We have a $600 million hole this year. Last year, you remember, we had a $200 million hole, but we had more tax revenue than we've ever had as a state. So you can see that we have a structural problem in our budgeting. And why is that? And we've talked about that before. There's $3 billion. In addition to the $7 billion that the legislature has available to put into a budget every year, there's another $3 billion that comes out of the exact same pot. It's money available to be budgeted, that's earmarked, that comes in and goes out automatically to different state agencies and entities around the state. So you have $10 billion that comes in. There's $3 billion that leaves, and then whatever's left, the legislature gets to appropriate. That $3 billion goes to a number of places that are important. They were politically popular. That's why those earmarks and designations were put in place. But in years like this, and particularly as those areas automatically grow every year, it makes it more challenging, and it creates these holes for the legislature. As more and more money go to these off-the-top funds and these earmarks, there's less available for us. So our part we get to appropriate shrinks as those earmarks grow every year. And we've talked about what those things are. That's things like our road and bridge funding, which has been significant, which was necessary after 20 years of neglect in Oklahoma. From 1984 until 2004, ODOT's budget didn't change. It was $200 million in 1984. It was $200 million in 2004. Didn't change for 20 years, but you know the buying power and the inflation that took place from 1984 to 2004. So there's no wonder our roads and bridges were in the shape that they're at. We started that journey of funding roads and bridges. Since that time, we've put over $2 billion now in new money. $2 billion in the last 8 or 9 years, Bryce, that we've been at the Capitol. Since the majority's changed in the legislature to start investing in roads and bridges, over $2 billion into roads and bridges. And that's just on the state system. We've put almost $900 million into county roads and bridges, which may be even more important for our districts, where our constituents probably spend more time driving more miles on county roads and bridges than they do on the state system or on city streets. So we put over $2 billion into the state system. We've put 800, and I tell you exactly what the number is, into the county system. It's $865,338,543 that we put into county roads and bridges in the last 8 years as well. So we've been investing in infrastructure, but those things automatically happen and they grow every year. ODOT's funding increases 65 million every year. So whatever ODOT got last year, they automatically get 65 million more the next year until we get up to that cap of being able to fix our roads and bridges to the level that they need to be across the state. Again, very important, automatically happens. The legislature gets what's left to appropriate in the budget. The OLAP program for higher education, students whose parents are below a certain income level, the students make good grades in high school, they stay out of trouble, do what they're supposed to do, we pay for them to go to college. The state regents set the tuition, the state regents determine how many are qualified, they send us the bill, we pay it in full each and every year. An important program that we made as a decision that we're going to help get more college graduates in Oklahoma, but that program continues to grow every year. $40, $50, $60 million every year that we write a check for to pay for those young people to be able to go to college. Again, that check's written. Whatever's left is what the legislature gets to appropriate. Teachers' retirement system, we've been putting hundreds of millions of dollars into teachers' retirement to turn it around, and we're finally turning the corner in that system to make it more healthy. After years before we got there where there were some raids made of those funds, dollars redirected, COLAs given without funding in election years. We've tried to manage that. Randy McDaniel, who grew up right here in Alva, has been our leader in the House in making those reforms. Same with the public employees retirement system. You just go on and on and on. All these things that are very important. The House Bill 1017 fund. You hear a lot of talk about our public schools, our K through 12, our pre-K through 12 schools, and their funding, particularly this year, being flat. What you don't hear about is there's a House Bill 1017 fund created 25 years ago that continues to grow every year, over $700 million that will go to public schools this year. Again, it's out of the state budget, so the legislature doesn't really get credit for it. It comes out of our same pot. We write that check first, and then we build our budget for their state appropriation after that fact. All of those things, very important, very popular, but in years like this, because they automatically happen, we don't have the flexibility to be able to adjust and say, you know, this year instead of $750 million into the House Bill 1017 fund, we may only be able to do $700 million more to schools, or adjustments in OLAP, or adjustments in the retirement systems, or in road and bridge funding. Again, they were put that way because they were priorities, but it takes away the flexibility. Just for example. State agencies have a number of different funding sources, and so it's really hard when you just look at the state budget. One of the changes we made in our state budget this year was to list all those other funding sources so that you can see that. What we have, and we deal with at the Capitol, is groups will come in and they only want to talk about their state appropriation. They don't want to talk about all the other funding sources that may be growing. They just talk about their state appropriation. And so when you see that publicly in the news or on the internet, the things that they put out, they'll single out those things, those certain areas, and not look at the entire picture. The legislature's been slow to get up to speed on looking at the entire picture, but this year as we built our budget, we started going back and looking not only at all the revenue sources that our entities have, but also at where we've come from since the recession. We had a study done to go back and look at 2008 forward and how much have these agencies been cut. What have the results of our budget cuts been as we've gone through the recession? Who's fared better? Who's had really devastating cuts? Who probably can't be cut anymore without impacting their mission? For example, if you look at common education, and again, they get a lot of media attention, but if you look at their funding in FY14, we had more funding going to schools in Oklahoma than ever in the history of the state. You don't hear that from those groups. But then this is, as you just look back from FY04 up to FY14 and we get to the high water mark. You hear a lot of talk about 08, 09 before the recession. In FY09, we spent $4.462 billion total on public schools in Oklahoma. In FY14, last year, we spent $4.4947 billion on schools in Oklahoma. And we've had some enrollment growth and some other things that have changed as well, but our funding has been increasing as well. 51 cents on every dollar in Oklahoma spent on education. A third of that goes to public schools. This chart, you can't see it real well, but you can tell the difference in colors. The bottom amount is property taxes that go to schools, which continues to be a growing part of the revenue stream. The property taxes go up in many cases every year. The largest part of that goes to public schools. This yellow number, that is the House Bill 1017 fund that grows each and every year. As I mentioned, it's part of our state revenue. We write the check for that, and again, whatever's left is in the general revenue fund for us to build a budget. That's not added to, even though this is their state appropriation, which is kind of ebbed and flowed. The House Bill 1017 fund that goes up, when you add those two together, that money comes from the same pot, but it's not calculated in total by the education groups. The top number is federal funding. Again, the biggest amount of federal funding was stimulus dollars that came in FY 10 and 11. Again, that number's pulled back down now to a little under $500 million in federal funds. I just show you that to give you one example of all the different funding sources that the state agencies have. When we looked back at how we got to this point, when you go back and look at budget reductions since 2000 and the recession in 2008, and just in the area of education, for example, our public schools have fared much better than many other agencies. Our funding, our state appropriation piece of the pie is only 1.85% less over that period of time. So since FY09, fiscal year 2009, to fiscal year 15, the common education budget's only decreased by 1.85%. When you look at other areas, they've not fared as well as our schools have. When you look at higher education, for example, they've been cut over 5% over that same period of time. When you look at career tech, again, one of the biggest cuts in career tech, over 12%, 12.35% over that same period of time. So sometimes you have to dig in and really look, because it's not necessarily the issue you're hearing about the most that it really bears out in the real numbers of what's happened. And that's something that we've really tried to do in our budgeting process, is not just look at year to year to year, but to go back and look at where have we been and where are we going, looking back more years and looking ahead. And I share those numbers with you, but when you look at other agencies like OETA, for example, a fourth of their budget has been cut since 2009. Over 25% of their budget is gone. And they took an additional cut this year as well. They were not held flat in this year's budget. So when you start looking at those types of agencies, the Arts Council at 26% cut, OCAST over 25%, and then you get into other agencies as well to see these numbers, and you start seeing the impact. The Healthcare Authority in Oklahoma, we hear a lot of talk about that. The Healthcare Authority's budget actually has grown over that period that a lot of agencies have been cut. Healthcare Authority has grown over 13%. Their budget's been increased 13% over that period of time. The Health Department's budget actually is down about 20% over that same period of time. But again, without that type of information to look at and see where we are, it's really hard to build a budget this year when you don't know what all has happened historically in the last several years since the recession. DHS's funding is up 20% over that time period. So they have fared better than many agencies in the area of human services. But then you look at places like the Agriculture Department, which is important, the services they provide to our area, their budget's been cut over 25% in that same period of time. And that's just again a few examples of where we are that helps you realize and see when you in these silos that you get little bits of information about one area of the budget or another. The challenge we have is we have to look at the entire picture, and you also have to look historically at where we've been. I'm going to stop there. The only other thing that I do want to mention in the area of reforms, we did make a couple of other changes in our budgeting structure that hopefully will be helpful. Motor vehicle fees, county road and bridge program fees, some tourism dollars that were all earmarks that automatically went out. We put some caps on those programs. That's not to say those programs won't get new dollars. It's just to say we've capped them at historic highs. They were at historic highs in terms of what they're getting. We've capped those. And so anything over that amount now, the legislature will have to decide that those dollars need to go to those programs, or they'll be able to adjust and send them to other areas if there are greater needs from year to year. But again, those caps were all put in place at the high water marks on motor vehicle fees. This last year, we collected more in motor vehicle fees and taxes than we ever have, and so we capped those earmarks at those levels. And that money goes to schools, it goes to the state transportation fund, it goes to a number of county funds. There's a county highway fund, there's a county road fund, there's a county highway fund, there's a county general fund, there's a cities and towns fund. But all of those were at all-time highs, and so we've capped those, and so they will they will be able to meet that cap of an all-time high, but any number above that will go into, or will stay in general revenue for us to be able to either send to those programs if that's the priority of the year, or adjust into the places. The other thing that we did in reforms in those programs all had hold harmless provisions in place, which meant that if the revenue dropped, if, for example, our motor vehicle taxes and fee money declined, we didn't collect as much, those agencies that got those earmarks were guaranteed to get the same amount they got the year before. That was what their percentage was. It's a percentage of that amount or whatever you got last year, whichever is more. And so when those funds would drop, if you didn't have as much collected in motor vehicle fees and that pot of money was smaller, you still had to pay the same level as you did the year before. That money came out of the general revenue fund to hold those funds harmless. We're not able to continue to do that, and that was another reform that we put in place as well. Those funds and the entities that receive money will ebb and flow now with the revenue stream, which is the only way that we're able to do that going forward. Tax credits as well. We've talked about that $1.7 billion that we give away each year in credits, incentives, deductions, exemptions. There's $1.7 billion there that also leaves, in addition to the $3 billion of earmarks and the $7 billion we put into the budget. We've made some reforms there. We did some things in the area of wind energy to adjust our credit but still be competitive with surrounding states. But the most important thing we did in the area of tax credits is that we passed a bill that the governor signed that will now review every tax credit in the state of Oklahoma every 4 years. So a fourth of them every year will be reviewed. A cost-benefit analysis will be provided to the legislature. That doesn't mean that the legislature has to get rid of one. It just means they'll have the information to finally know, is the cost to the state greater than the benefit? There may be some credits that it's important for us for a policy reason as a state to have in place that cost us more money than what they generate. But we'll actually have the information to make that decision. Never before, sadly, in the history of our state have we had that information. And we will now have that information to evaluate those credits and be able to make adjustments as well. So again, not a revenue problem. When you have $3 billion in earmarks, when you have another $1.7 billion that you give away, that includes things all of us in this room use. That's your standard deduction on your income tax form. That's your sales tax exemption for veterans or different entities that are sales tax exempt. For agriculture, that's your mortgage deduction on your income tax form, in addition to all those economic development credits that are kind of the poster child for reforms. That includes all of those things. And again, a lot of those things are very popular, particularly when it comes to April 15th and we're all filling out our income tax forms. So very difficult to make reforms in, but at least we will have the information to make educated decisions on what's best for the state. Senator?